hoodie is back. So's the bloody earwax. It's blocking my ear up, something awful. Ow, fuck me. Good morning. I hope everyone is doing well today. So at some point, I suspect I am going to have to pop a visit to my local shop and get some olive oil, trying to clear all this shit out. It's always frustrating for me when I get a bloody ear, well, not an ear infection. I might have had one before, but I can't remember. But earwax is just so obnoxious when it comes out. It is what it is, I guess, and I guess more than anything, after this swig, we'll get to reading the book again. I'm just going to have to grin and bear it. Right, so page 301, I believe. The irony of Powell's courage in speaking out for the indigenous people of Britain was that Powell's popularity with the indigenous people was what subsequently enabled the Con-Socialist Party to become the government in 1970. And the Con-Socialist Party then immediately submitted the UK to the anti-democratic rule by the European Union, or the EU, where the oligarchy ruled by diktat. Powell's aim was to stop his own party from working within an assumed socialist framework. Oh, by the way, Enoch Powell is who I mean. Anyway, Powell's aim was to stop his own party from working within an assumed socialist framework, to turn them from con-socialists into conservatives. But Powell's anti-socialist economic policies of the 1950s and 1960s were not adopted by his con-socialist party until the late 1970s. By which time Thatcher had replaced the pro-EU traitor Edward Heath. Couldn't have put that better myself. For those who are wondering, Edward Heath was the person who signed us up to the European Union. He was directly responsible for getting us to join the European Union and thus start off our £55 million a day gross payment towards unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. But back to the book. A decade after Thatcher embraced Powell's economic policies, she was removed by the Con-Socialist Party because she had started down another of the paths laid out by Powell, challenging the anti-democratic EU superstate. Perhaps if Thatcher hadn't been stabbed in the back by the Con-Socialist Party, and a Thatcherite had led the party for another decade, they'd have adopted Powell's policies on immigration instead of allowing Labour's policy of population replacement. Powell's biographer concludes saying, the unresolved conflict with his opponents was the question of whether the British people wished to remain a nation. It was a question he put not just to their political representatives, who to which greater extent controlled the people's destinies, but directly to the people themselves. This is still the pressing question. Do the British people have any fight left in them, or will they just meekly be replaced? The oligarchy equate Mosley and Powell, even though Mosley was a socialist whose ideology has been the dominant ideology in Britain since 1945. Whilst Powell has spent his entire career, politically, as an outsider fighting to destroy the Keynesian, Mosleyan, Fabian ideology of the socialist state that subordinated the individual to the collective. Through Thatcher, one plank of Powell's politics was put into action. When Thatcher tried to put a second plank of Powell's politics into action, she was destroyed by her own party. Con-socialism triumphed. That second plank was finally put in place by the people having a say and opting out of the EU during the Brexit vote. In the 1990s, the Con-Socialist Party had been prepared to be ousted from government rather than have the British people leave the EU. With New Labour, the oligarchy recommitted to their leftist project to set about the replacement of the population of Britain to ensure that the Fabian project that started in the 1880s reaches completion, and from 2010, the next Con-Socialist government intensified the speed of replacement. Population replacement is just another form of eugenics. The oligarchy have had 9 hours sleep, believe it or not, have decided electing Thatcher and voting for Brexit must be destroyed. They've decided that the British people, in showing their support for Powell's views, and the other stuff, must be destroyed. Eugenics was not just accidental to the socialist project. It is essential. Their project is the supremacy of the state over the individuals. One reason why eugenics found an almost natural home among socialist and left-leaning liberals was that it dovetailed with their preference for collectivism, state interventionism, and social engineering and planning. No less poignant is the fact that there are three key progressives, who play a vital role in the development of the British welfare state. John Maynard Keynes, Richard Titmuss, and William Beveridge. They were all members of the Eugenics Society. That should brighten the video up a little bit. Anyway, the elite who believe in an all-powerful state, who describes the Fabians, naturally see it that the state has the right to farm the people it controls. To Fabians, the individual has no higher value other than the place where he fits in their socially engineered machine. The target of the oligarchy's racism has changed. The racism is now directed at the indigenous people, particularly the men, the most disadvantaged group in Britain, white working class men. The oligarchy don't care if the sheep they farm are black or white, provided we sheep accept our position of subjugation. Population replacement is just another form of eugenics, and supposedly it's not racist because the victims are white. I'm not calling him sir. As Tony the War Criminal Blair said in his 2003 speech to the Fabian Society in relation to the British electorate voting Thatcher into power 3 elections in a row, the challenge for us now is to make our progressive changes across the board irreversible. Changes that can't be rolled back by a right-wing government that wants to dismantle all that we have achieved. Or have... Huh? Sorry. I'm reading this wrong because of the fact there's actually a spelling error. Because it goes, that wants to dismantle all that we have achieved, is what I said. But there's, we have be. I don't know. Spelling errors, man, and grammar errors. Anyway, to do that, to make the deeper changes, we have to make the cultural changes necessary as well as the policy changes, emphasis added. Removing the indigenous people is that deep cultural change. As the communist Brecht says in the quotation at the start of this chapter, the anti-democratic thing to do is for the oligarchy to elect another people. The moderate Fabians can come out and make anti-democratic speeches published in the media stating that they are making changes that no future government, no future electorate will be able to undo, save in the knowledge that the con-socialists won't draw attention to these things because they too are socialists like the Fabians. Maybe it's my body trying to combat this damn earwax, I don't know. Give me a moment. That's the democracy of Fabian socialism, making gradual changes to society that are so deep they can never be undone. In that speech, Blair describes Thatcherism as the real enemy of progressives. The Fabian Project is one of the progressive movements by the Fabian elite. Blair openly stated in that speech to the Fabians that we, the Fabians, must make our progressive changes across the board irreversible, changes that can't be rolled back by a right-wing government. Isn't the anti-democratic socialism of the Fabians obvious and explicit? The electorate are to be prevented from stopping the Fabian Project. Should we realise what they're up to? The Fabian Project supersedes Parliament and democracy. The Fabian Project is to be irreversible, and the oligarchy have set out to make it irreversible by replacing the population who elected Thatcher. If we are to tell you that the Fabians have been wolves disguised as sheep, you might think we are being overdramatic. But this is exactly how they want history to remember them. In describing the Fabian window at the London School of Economics, unveiled by war criminal Tony Blair in 2006, the Fabians say that their portrayal in this window, Sidney Webb and Shaw himself are shown hammering out a new world on an anvil beneath an emblem of the wolf in sheep's clothing, reflecting the society's gradualist approach. That the Fabians, explicitly admitting that deceit is the essence of what they do, pretend to the farm animals that the Fabians are sheep too, when in reality, the Fabians know that they are wolves who prey on the sheep, and it is reality. Sorry, it is it. Can't get the words out today. And it isn't like this deceit is another of the past policies from which the Fabians want to dissociate themselves, such as their racism and their 6 decades of eugenics. Fabians designed their memorial image. Fabians paid for the window's construction, and the window was installed by a Fabian Institute in the presence of war criminal Tony Blair, the most noteworthy Fabian of the day. Shaw had published an article in London's Evening Standard's newspaper, 17th of March 1938, proclaiming Heil Hitler. Yet, the window is Shaw's design, and he even depicted himself in the window creating a new world order, cloaked by deceit so the masses won't realise how the Fabians' plans to change the world are being executed. The Fabians admit the LSE itself was established by Shaw and the Webbs with money donated to them for propaganda. Can you imagine the never-ending outrage if there was a right-wing university set up by racist, genocidal eugenicists created for the purpose of propaganda with a prime minister in attendance, when propagandist artwork praising the deceitful principles of the organisation were unveiled? The oligarchy are leftists, so there is no outrage at what the Fabians have done. The Fabian window had first been unveiled in 1947 by another Labour Prime Minister, just 2 years after the defeat of Hitler. But while the Fabians were promoting eugenics still, and less than a decade after George Bernard Shaw chose to shout Heil Hitler from the newsstands of London, clearly the left has no real shame about the views and policies of the Fabians' founders. So what is going to be able to undo the slow-motion destruction brought by to the West by progressive socialists? Not Keir the traitor Starmer. He's another Fabian, as are many in his cabinet. In 2005, con-socialist Lord David the Conman Cameron described himself as the heir to Blair. So no one should have been surprised when 14 years of con-socialist rule just led us to a greater speed of population replacement. It would be no surprise if David Cameron had been a member of the Fabian Society. After all, there are multiple claims that he was a founding signatory to the Trotskyist self-styled anti-fascist organization. See Chapter 2 above. The Fabians failed to get traction with liberals and conservatives in the 19th century, so the Fabians helped create the Socialist Labour Party, with its communist policy of nationalisation, state ownership of industry, devised by Fabian ideologue Sidney Webb. After the Fabians created the Labour Party, liberals and socialists simply aped the Socialist Party controlled by the Fabians. But the Fabians are keen to hide the Webb's support for Lenin and Stalin and Lenin's admiration for the Webbs. That the Fabians could exist for 150 years and received scant attention is a testament to their ability to conceal themselves and to deceive the public, wolves pretending to be sheep. They were assisted in this by the fact that the Fabians received virtually no opposition in the previous 100 years. As noted earlier, for decades they got to brainwash the public through the BBC, a con-socialist created crypto-fascist state broadcaster. The Fabians have controlled British politics for more than a century, and the Thatcher Revolution was the only period when Fabianism was being pushed back. The socialism of war criminal Tony Blair has been dominant ever since the con-socialists stabbed Thatcher in the back. A socialism of deception, wars, i.e. Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., stroke number 1, etc., etc., intimidation, censorship, population replacement, leading to increased control by the fascist state. Perhaps you are still unconvinced. Blair explicitly named what his socialism should be known as. See his Fabian book, The Third Way. In this 1998 booklet, Blair said the concept of the Third Way is the best label for the new politics which the progressive centre left is forging. The Third Way stands for a modernised social democracy, passionate in its commitment to social justice and the goals of the centre left, but innovative and forward-looking in the means to achieve them. It is founded on the values that have guided progressive politics for more than a century: democracy, liberty, justice, mutual obligation, and internationalism. Well, we all know that's a crock of shit, don't we? But it's a third way because it moves decisively beyond an old left preoccupied by state control, high taxation, and producer interests, and a new right treating public investment and often the very notions of society and collective endeavour as evils to be undone. Now, before I go any further, the Third Way sounds like the Third Reich, doesn't it? Anyway, emphasis added. It's specifically a return to the progressive, gradual Fabian project values that have guided progressive politics for more than a century, and specifically opposed to the Thatcher revolution against socialism, the new right. Don't be fooled by phrases like social democracy. That's exactly how the Marxist Party in Germany called itself, the party for which Mitchell's was a member. Blair's government cared so much about justice that they permitted Muslim gangs to continue unopposed their decades systematically raping English schoolgirls. Blair's Fabian government cared so little about liberty that they passed laws criminalising the criticism of stroke number 2 of criticising Islam. Jesus. Notice that this supposedly innovative Fabian direction was still focusing on internationalism and collectivism, just as Stalinism did. See Appendix 9. If they really cared about democracy, they would have been debating about how to implement direct democracy. But the oligarchy is what the progressives want because they are to be the social engineers in control. Blair wasn't alone in describing his ideology in this way. At the same time, US President Bill Clinton also described his democratic ideology as the Third Way, that is neither the right nor left, but new and different. You might think this is all very sweet and soothing, but you need to remember that the wars of Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, so many people died for progressive social justice and regime change. Moreover, there's something even more sinister beneath the surface of war criminal Tony Blair's ghoulish fake grin. Avowed fascists of the 1920s and 1930s also described what they were doing as the Third Way. As the expert on fascism said in the 1920s and 1930s, a new myth emerged, that of the creation of a third way between the opposing forces of capitalism and communism. The socialists of all parties, as Hayek described them, with their mercenaries in the media and academia, have succeeded in creating the mythical fascist far right, such that the progressives can literally use the exact same concepts and phrases as Mussolini and Mosley, and no one draws attention to it. Even the socialist Adolf Hitler stated the importance of social justice in a speech a year after he served on the Bavarian Soviet government. But the tens of thousands of books on Hitler and Nazism do all they can to conceal Hitler's socialism. In Mussolini's 4 speeches on the corporate state, he too spoke of social justice. The book is 1935, by the way. The object of the regime in the economic field is to ensure higher social justice for the whole Italian people. What does higher social justice mean? It means work guaranteed, fair wages, decent homes. It means the possibility of continuous evolution and improvement. In his 2007 book, Liberal Fascism, Jonah Goldberg says of the concept, the third way, that is the quintessentially fascistic formulation that claims to be neither left nor right. Mussolini and Hitler could sound every bit as benign as war criminal Tony Blair to those who benefited from their social justice. Are we to think it's purely coincidental that Blair and Clinton should choose the same concept as the fascists did? Or are we to think Blair and Clinton were not surrounded by teams of advisors who studied philosophy, politics, and economics, or some equivalent? No one noticed the use of the same concept. That the same ideology was proposed simultaneously in both the UK and the USA shows the oligarchy at work. People like Blair and Clinton are not in charge. They are just doing what the oligarchy has decided should be done to further the progressive project. After Clinton was replaced as president by George Bush, a man hated by the left, Blair became Bush's comrade in arms. And despite the puppet theatre of politicians supposedly opposing each other, it's not unusual to see a gaggle of 3 or 4 such enemies all laughing and joking together. You might think that only some politic nerd would recognise Blair and Clinton were using the same concept as Mussolini and Mosley, but the first paragraph of the Encyclopaedia Britannica article on the Third Way discusses it is a fascist concept and includes a photograph of war criminal Tony Blair. The article goes on to discuss the third way of the British New Labour and Britain's peculiar experiments with corporatism in the 1960s and 70s. So, Britannica highlights another concept, corporatism, fundamental both to fascism and to Britain's liberal democracy throughout the 20th century. Outside the media narrative sanctioned by the fascist state, it is recognised, A, that Britain was corporatist for at least as long as Marxist Mussolini Britain was Italy was. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Mussolini's Britain. No, Mussolini's Italy was corporatist. B, this corporatism was was curtailed during the Thatcher Revolution. And C, Britain returned to an enthusiastic corporatism under the third programme of New Labour. From 2024 onwards, under Keir the Traitor Starmer, with a democratic mandate weaker than Hitler's in 1932, Britain is still run by an oligarchy enthusiastic for fascism because they profit from it. If anything, the Britannica article fails to recognise the extent of the corporatism of Britain from the 19th century onwards. Remember in chapter 3.3, we pointed out the history books for British schoolchildren openly discussed the growth of the corporate state in Britain from 1914 to 1945. The crypto-fascist BBC was created in 1927. The oligarchy relies on the public not to see the connections, distracted as they are by celebrities, sports, gambling, trash, TV, etc., etc. Or, in my case, gaming, though it didn't work out fully, did it? Because I started to wake up, didn't I? Also, that little was because I was kind of getting confused with reading the lines. Anyway, this third way was operating in Britain from at the latest World War I until the 1970s. From 1979 to 1990, Thatcherism truly was an anomaly in a century of British fascism. The fascistic policies of leftism were constrained and reversed, only to resurface in both Labour and Socialist parties with the success of war criminal Tony Blair. Thatcherism was cut short by the oligarchy because fascism suits the oligarchy's project of honing the animals into a more profitable farm for their owners. I should also point out, because I haven't mentioned this, I'm never going to call Keir the Traitor Starmer or Tony the War Criminal Sir. That's why I'm using their titles as War Criminal and Keir the Traitor Starmer, for anybody wondering. Anyway, the animals are fooled that the managerial elite of pigs are sincere about their promises of a welfare state. Any dissenter will be treated like Snowball or Goldstein and smeared as far right. As the quotation from the communist Brecht at the start of this chapter shows, when the left realise that the public won't vote in tune to the left's commands and deceptions, then the left know that the public must be replaced. Minus the military forms of Mussolini, but with the black shirts of the state-funded anti-fascists, the fascists... Stroke number 3. The fascism of Fabianism has chosen the indigenous people of Europe as the target for their collective hatred of the left. Any criticism of any aspect of the Fabian project has been crushed since the Consocialists stabbed Thatcher in the back. After the working class chose the Thatcher Revolution, individualism and capitalism instead of collectivism and socialism, the socialists realised that their best option was to destroy the working class, and since the current socialist Prime Minister of Britain, Keir the Traitor Starmer, is described by the Fabian Society himself, or itself, as very Fabian, and many of his cabinet are known Fabians, we should not expect the Labour or Socialist project of population replacement to stop or go in reverse. We should expect it to intensify. We've seen the Fabians openly admit their project is one of transformation at a speed that is so incremental that the changes in effect before the public realise what has been done, and the Fabians glory in deceptive wolves concealed in the harmless skins of sheep. The Fabians know they are only pretending to be harmless and pretending to be just like us. They have an anti-democratic transformative project. Thus, one of the aims of the oligarchy is to prevent the public from understanding what mass immigration truly means, namely, population replacement. It means the end of the people in Europe. It is a form of genocide, being conducted at a speed that makes it hard to identify, precisely the Fabian method. Remember that time is a part of reality that they know is more alien to the working class, generally speaking. The higher you look up the social scale, the greater the time scale in which people are prepared to plan. Time is one of the limbs of the elephant we don't notice, so they exploit this to bring about serfdom gradually. Leftist propagandist groups of the oligarchy, such as the ISD, try to scare the public away from acknowledging that the UN plan is a plan for genocide. But let us look at the United Nations' own Convention on Genocide. Article 2 of the Convention says that genocide is acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The Convention doesn't state that genocide is only carried out using concentration camps or killing fields, but acknowledges a range of more subtle ways in which genocide is conducted. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, etc., etc. What is the UN policy of migration replacement but a plan to destroy it? In whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial group. This is not essentially about race, but the indigenous people of these islands are white, and the indigenous people are being replaced by Ukrainians, Nigerians, French, Pakistanis, Indians, Vietnamese, etc., etc. Only white people can be racist is gaslighting designed to distract the indigenous people from the racist plan to eliminate us. In 2011, rioters looted and burned London. The riots spread to other parts of England, and the rioters were mostly not indigenous British people. The police stood back and let the replacement population riot. At the time, the oligarchy lied and said that the rioters were not of immigrant descent, but the photographic evidence and the convictions exposed these lies. When immigrants who were not rioters, such as Sikhs or Muslims, went out on the streets of the enclaves where they predominate, they were praised by the oligarchy as heroes, even though these men were shown waving swords and other weapons ready for violence. Turkish shopkeepers who stood guard outside their businesses and chased off looters on Monday night have been hailed as heroes when the gang of youngsters arrived to wreak havoc in Dalston. East London on Monday night, the men armed with baseball bats, snooker cubes, and even chair legs sent them packing. But in the few areas of London that were still predominantly inhabited by white British people, such as Enfield and Eltham, the police swooped on the indigenous people and forced them off the streets. More two-tier policing, basically. So this thing has been in effect for a long time. Months later, the oligarchy admitted that the 2011 rioters were disproportionately immigrants. This two-tier policing is a deliberate policy of the oligarchy. I just mentioned it. The oligarchy promote and protect their mascot groups, and the oligarchy have set out to destroy the indigenous people. And this is happening not just in Britain, but in France, in Germany, in Sweden, in Ireland, etc., etc. The oligarchy despise no one as much as they despise the indigenous people of these nations. The oligarchy despise us and seek our destruction because it was Europe that invented democracy and spread it to the world. The oligarchy need to bring tribal conflict to our nations before the public realise they have been bought off by the money bubble, before the masses realise that direct democracy is the only real democracy, and before we realise that we do not need to let the oligarchy rule us and farm us. As we proved in Muhammad's Quran, the oligarchy knew that importing Islam would lead to violence, because Islam is founded on Muslims using violence to subjugate non-Muslims. See Appendix 12 of the Manifesto. But of course the mainstream media won't tell you this. You know the drill, folks, because say it with me, it doesn't suit the narrative. But back on point. All of this was common knowledge among educated people in the West until the 1970s. Even children's comic books, as late as 1977, portrayed Muhammad as leading an infernal army of fanatical jihadis in accordance with the most authentic Islamic biographies of the founder of Islam. As Professor Samuel Huntington explained in his book The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order 1996, Islam has bloody borders. Maybe you think Huntington is some crackpot. Well, the cover of Huntington's book has praise from Henry Kissinger, the American statesman who invented the petrodollar and globalization, saying it was one of the most important books of the decade. Despite Huntington explaining Islam's position in history in the simplest possible terms, the oligarchy in the West proceeded to bring in the West millions and millions of the fanatical followers of the warlord Muhammad. The oligarchy know what they are doing. They have the education, they have the books, they have the experts to consult. The oligarchy want the bloody borders to be between streets and towns in our previously peaceful countries. The oligarchy are determined to prevent real democracy coming to the West and have imported tribal conflict to ensure this. At no point did any political party or government in Britain put the question to the public, do you want to keep your pensions by becoming an ethnic minority in your own country, surrounded by devout followers of the warlord Muhammad? So what is being done to the British people, to the demos, is stroke number 4, is anti-democratic replacement. A policy by the oligarchy that will see most families die out before the end of this century. The church leaders are happily overseeing the destruction of their flock. By the end of this century, Christianity, the dominant religion of Britain for 1500 years, will have been replaced by Islam. Think about that. Christianity has spread peaceably in Britain before the founder of Islam had even started his campaign of robbery, enslavement, and killing to scare people in Arabia to submit to him. In the 1970s, even children knew this authentic history of Islam. There were movies made in England in the 1950s that showed the risk of having Muslims near English school girls. They warned that Islam had a long history of sexual slavery of non-Muslims. An entire series of policies instituted by the oligarchy have seen serious bodily and mental harm done to the people of Britain. For 50 years, on an industrial scale, immigrant gangs were allowed to drug and rape English schoolgirls with impunity. The police and public prosecutors, I should point out these are all in bullet points, by the way. The police and public prosecutors will not prosecute racist violence by immigrants against the indigenous population. Point 3. The state builds subsidised housing using the taxes of the indigenous people, then gives the subsidised housing to the replacement population. Social housing is disproportionate. Stroke number 5. Man alive. Social housing is disproportionately replacement population. Social housing is disproportionately occupied. Sorry, I read that because I had a stroke. I'm reading the lines wrong. So I'll start again. The state builds subsidised housing using the taxes on the indigenous people, then gives this subsidised housing to the replacement population. Social housing is disproportionately occupied by people born overseas. The indigenous people forced to subsidise the replacement population. And I couldn't even get that other bit right, and I still had a stroke. Policies on money printing, inflation, taxation, debauching the currency, industrial decline, and bubbles in the prices of houses have made it harder for people to afford to have larger families. That's point 4. Point 5. The rare people who have spoken out against these policies by the oligarchy have seen their lives destroyed.